this is Mihai, and for this video we're going to solve a very interesting challenge, which is actually quite common when you try to integrate different systems or automate data, and eventually you would have to model the data. So the challenge is like this. You have an API or a database or some place from where you extracted the data regarding users in this example, but you could have anything basically. Like, for example, you have the users and I have defined the minimum required data like the ID of the user and the email of the user, and the first endpoint that you would call would give you a list of all the users. And then for each of the users that you have in this list, you would have to get the list of devices in this case. But you can have scenarios where you could have the list of, I don't know, files, list of emails, list of books, list of tasks, list of anything. So for each of the users here, you would have to query a second endpoint or a database or something from where you would extract a list of something, in this case again, devices, for each of the users. Now the challenge is that you would have to combine the input, the first input, with each of the second input for each of the item in the first input. Hope that makes sense. And you would have to combine it in a singular output. Now the way I thought to structure this output would be a list of lists, right? So when you have a square bracket, this is a list, and basically in each of the list I would have the list of devices for each of the users plus the information that comes from the user. As you can see here, this is the first user and those are the devices of the first user. But I do not have the information regarding the user in the input that I get with the devices for that particular user. And then I have the list of the second user and so on. So this is basically the second user, and those are the devices of the second user. So this is the challenge. You can structure the combined data in any way, but we should see how can you achieve this result. Okay, so let's get going. The first thing that we should do is create a process. Okay, let's give it a name, and we would say combine data from two APIs. Okay, cool. Now, as I mentioned, you can get this data from an API or from a database or from whatever, and for this demonstration I have prepared a database that will give me this information. And by building this process, I will also show to you how you can test as you build, and this is very useful to get the process going and to debug it as you build it. Now I have chosen the execute query action. I already have a predefined credential here, and now I need to configure the select of this query, the actual query. Now the way we're going to do this is that I already have prepared my select. Where is it? Cool. So I will get all the users from the database, and I will store this information in a user list, which would be a JSON list. I will create the variable, and now let's test to see what I get. Perfect. This is fresh information from the database. I will copy this information to create a data model out of this. It's very useful to use data models where you build processes because it allows you to easily access the information within the data. So I copied this structure, and I will be creating a data model out of this structure, and I will create it from a JSON, and I will call it user. Notice is user, not users, because when I'm going to paste the payload, which is an array, a list of items, I have this as invalid. And that's because PROCESIO wants you to give it only one item. Only one item. Now it's valid. I will preview the data model. It identified the two fields that I have in my data, and now I can use this model in my query, right? Initially I defined this variable as a list of JSON, but I'm going to change this to a list of user, which is basically the data model that I just created. Cool. Now I have the list of users in this user list variable, and the next thing that I need to do is iterate through this list. Cool. Now the second thing that I would need to do is to configure the for each. Now I'm going to iterate through the user list, and notice that I have also the attributes of the list, and each of the item that I iterate will be called user. And I set the timeout to 0, which is indefinite time. And the user iterator, you would see it also as a variable of type read only. Cool. Now let's configure what happens in the for each. The next thing that I want to do is get the list of devices for that particular user. Okay, now I mentioned that you could have the data in an API or a database. For the demonstration purpose of this video, I'm going to use a database for which I prepared an SQL statement, which is this one. I'm going to take only this part, paste it here. Notice that in the select I need to filter by the ID of the user in this case. So I will add the ID of the user. By pressing the combination Ctrl plus I get access to the variable list. Now what I want to use is the ID of the user, which is the current iterator from the for each. And I'm going to store this information in the list of devices variable, but I do not have that variable, so I will define it here. Devices list, and it's an object list. I will create the variable. Let's see what happens. Now I know that I have in the database I have a user ID 123, so I'm going to test with this. Let's see what I get from that endpoint. Perfect. So I get the list of devices. I will be creating a data model out of this data structure, out of the list of devices, and I already know that I don't need to copy everything. I need to copy only one element from that list, and I will create from the JSON. I will call it the device, edit from JSON, paste, and not yet preview data model because I still need to add the ID, which is of type integer, and the email. Basically, those are the information that I want to transfer from the first data, from the input one. Cool. So this should be cool. I have also the ID and the email. I'm creating the data model, and now let's go back here. Sorry, the variable device list, instead of object I will call it device, and I find the type. I will select the type device, and I find the data model that I just created. Now I have two variables. One is the user list, which is, and I have the current user in the loop, in the iterator, and the second data that I need to use to combine is the list of devices. Now, for this purpose, I There are multiple ways to do this, but I think the easiest way would be actually to use a JavaScript. And the JavaScript that I made is this one, and I will explain it in a second. So I'm going to delete those just to see what I did. So here is a variable. I need to add the variable from the list of variables, which is the user ID. The user is the current iterator in the current loop, and also the email of the current user. And then I would have to add the list of devices, which I got from the previous query from here, right? And then the script will do its job. I've created a function that basically replaces in every item of the array, in every element of the array, replaces the ID and the email. And then outputs the modified array so I can catch it. So I have here a JSON output, and I will call it JS output. I call it, it's a type, it's a JSON type. And then I need to extract the value out of this JSON, and I'm going to just for you to see why I'm doing the next thing that I'm doing. I'm going to validate, save the process. I'm going to run it once so you see it, and it should make sense more to you after you see why I'm going to do the next step. So this is the JavaScript output, and this is how it looks like. Okay, this is the last value from the for each. It has three devices for this particular user. Now, as you can see, everything is outputted on the results attribute, and that's why I'm going to extract the value of results using a JSON mapper action. And I'm querying the JSON out with using a JSON path query. This is it. Okay, and the result, I'm going to store it. As you can see, the output, the expected output, is of type object. So I will need to create an object variable, and I will say current list of devices, which is object, and I'm going to create the variable. So this is going to be stored in the variable. It's an object. It's a bit of a trick what I'm doing here, because I know that this object is actually going to be a list of objects, but this is a trick that I'm doing here in order to be able to use the list add action. One second. And here I'm going to call it output, which will be a list of objects, and I'm marking it as output, and I'm adding the object that I extracted, current list of devices. I'm adding this. Validate, save process, run the process, check the instance, and let's see what happened. Okay, it's running, all good. Now let's see the variables. This is the output, and as expected, I have a list of lists, an array of arrays. So I have an array with, and for each of the user I have another array, and within that are the elements, the devices in this case, with the ID and email filled in. Based on the structure that you have, you can design the process in any other way that you see fit. Hope that you enjoyed this video and I hope that you find it useful for your particular use case.